Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining Muslim Space. This is Tabrez, and want to thank Muslim Space for hosting this, all of the organizers, Shadia, and others. It's good to be here. This is titled, it's part of the Muslim speaker series titled Being Muslim, the Heart Space. And I'm going to turn it over here in a moment to Brother Saqib Safdar, who is the director of the Hikmah Project, which I'm also a participant in one of the circles. Saqib will explain a bit more about what that entails. I'll give a brief introduction to Brother Saqib. He is a lifelong seeker of sacred knowledge, and he's explored Eastern and Western spirituality, which has sparked in him a search for truth or object reality beyond one cultural or religious conditioning. He found answers to such metaphysical questions in the Qur'an itself through the works of Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and other great sages in the Islamic tradition. And he has studied with authorized masters of the Sufi tradition. I'm going to turn it over to Brother Saqib to let him present, and then we'll also have some time for Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Brother Tabriz. Can everyone hear me okay? I can just have a wave or a nod or okay, super. All right, wonderful. So thank you for the kind introduction. I really am in many ways not fit to be talking about this topic, but I guess as Tabriz has asked me and thought I should share, I've taken him up on his offer, and here I am presenting some ideas that I've been exploring around the Hikmah Project. So I'll share my screen, and I've been working in education for a number of years, and I guess in many ways this is a summary of a khutbah I once gave at college. Can everyone see the screen? If I can just have a wave or a nod? Thank you. Okay. And I think the idea behind the college was the khutbah was I had read in the paper that in some campuses in the UK they were planning to ban the khutbah or the Friday sermons because external sort of speakers were coming in. And I was a lecturer at college at the time, and I thought maybe these youngsters would really benefit from a different narrative. So I thought, let me present the tradition to them in a way which they may not have encountered before. And so a lot of these ideas are really around that, and it really resonated with a lot of them. So the heart space, let me just, right. So for me, the journey really begins with being Muslim beyond culture and identity. And it really started, my own journey really started by asking the question, is there reality beyond my conditioned reality? And if so, how do I know that? So it's a fundamental question. Am I Muslim because I've been born into a Muslim family? And if so, if I was born into a Jew, Christian, so etc. family, I would have taken on those beliefs and that faith. So how do I know there is a reality beyond my conditioning? And naturally, sort of exploring these questions, these are just some examples, but there are many people out there looking at mindfulness. Oprah has a Soul series with Eckhart Tolle, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Zen Buddhism. So on that stage, what does Islam have to offer? And I think very quickly I realized that this sort of discussion was just not happening in mosques, and many religious authorities would just not know what to do with a Ken Wilber or a Jiddu Krishnamurti. How would you interact with somebody who's not calling you to a new belief system, but is making you question your own in order to find, in order for you to transcend your level of conditioning. And so that's my first question. How do you know there's a reality beyond a subjective reality? Is there an objective reality? And so if we begin with the Quran asks us very beautifully, or reminds us, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يوم لا ينفع مال ولا بنون إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم. The day when neither wealth nor son shall profit except for him who comes to God with a pure heart. And naturally one asks, well, what is this qalbu salim? And I think it's a fascinating idea. The Quran presents us with the various terms around the heart. So you've got qalb, fu'ad, sadr. And suddenly there's this idea around, well, Allah is just asking you to come to him with a sound heart. And then the Quran also reminds us about the heart being an organ of perception. أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونَ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا أَوْ أَذَانٌ يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا فَإِنَّهَا لَا تَعْمَى الْأَبْصَارُ وَلَكِنْ تَعْمَى الْقُلُوبُ الَّتِي فِي الصُّدُورِ. So have we not journeyed in the land? Have they not journeyed in the land so that they have hearts to understand with or ears to hear with? Is it not the eyes that are blind, but blind are the hearts within their breasts? So now the Quran is suggesting here that the heart is also a spiritual organ, and one of the criteria, or the criteria on the Yawm al-Qiyamah, is to come to God with a sound heart. And a lot of this sort of dimension or teaching often gets doesn't really get emphasized when the primary discourse tends to be on legalism. And this led me to sort of explore further, and there is, if we now move to Imam Ali, so the early Sahaba, he was asked, have you seen God? And traditionally we've been told, Moses said, can I see you on the mount? And Allah said, to turn the other way. And in the Nahj al-Balagha, in the Sermon 179, a Jewish man named Zitlib asks Imam Ali, he tries to catch him out, and he says, Hal ra'ayta rabbuk ya amirul mu'minin, have you seen your Lord, O command of the faithful, amirul mu'minin? And Imam Ali says, Afa a'budu ma la ara, will I worship that whom I do not see? So Dhitlib tries to catch him out and says, well, kayfa tarahu, so how do you see him? And Imam Ali says, لا تدركه العيون بمشاهدة العيان ولكن تدركه القلوب بحقائق الإيمان. Eyes cannot see him. You cannot see him بمشاهدة العيان, with your eyes, but the heart can perceive him through the realities of faith, بحقائق الإيمان. And I think that's a fascinating dialogue there, because Imam Ali's not talking about some blind belief system to adopt, but really a unveiling, a perception through the heart of verifying reality. Just going back to our earlier question, is there subjective or objective reality, and how do we know that? So in addition to that, the Quran also reminds us about the heart's finding rest. And so we know that the heart is a perceiving organ. We know that it needs, we need a sound heart. Allah is asking us the criteria where on the Yawm al-Qiyamah, what will benefit you is a sound heart. Then the question is, how do you achieve this sound heart? And the Qur'an and the Islamic tradition remind us of invocation, remembrance, dhikrullah. So based on this, I'll just read one or two hadith which signify this spiritual dimension of remembrance, and then mysteriously take us into the transcendent and immanent dimensions of divine reality. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, narrated by Anas ibn Malik, the criterion of the love of God is the love of his invocation, dhikr. And the criterion of the hatred of God is the hatred of his invocation. And upon this, Imam al-Junayd, who's regarded as one of the key figures of early tasawwuf or Sufism, here's a quote by him: "The question of love was raised in a session of spiritual masters in Mecca during the session of pilgrimage. They asked al-Junayd, who at the time was the youngest amongst them, 'What is your opinion, O Iraqi?' Al-Junayd lowered his head, tears going down his face, and then he said, 'Love requires the servant to have abandoned his individuality, to constantly invoke his Lord, to perform all his duties before him, to have his heart turned to him until he is consumed by the lights of his being, to drink the pure water of his affection, so that God lifts the veils covering his mysteries. When such a man speaks, it is for God. If he expresses himself, it is on the subject of God. If he performs an act, it is by the order of God. If he rests, it is with God. He is from God, for God, with God.' The spiritual masters then started weeping and confessed, 'What more can one say? May God reward you, the crown of the sages.'" Another two hadith, so narrated by Ibn Masud, quoted by Tabarani, "Inna minan nasi mafatihu li dhikrillahi idha ru'u dhukrillah." Verily, certain persons are keys for the invocation of God. They arouse the invocation of God when they are seen. I believe there is a hadith that says, I'm paraphrasing here, the best of you are those when seen are reminded of God. So now this goes further, referring to Imam Ali, who, having realized a high degree of invocation of God and journeying on this path of proximity, this is now a hadith related by Ibn Masud. Looking at the face of Ali is an act of worship. And this, I believe, is a mutawatir hadith, authenticated hadith that's been narrated by a number of companions. So it's not disputed, it shouldn't be disputed. So looking at the face of Ali is ibadah. So in that hadith, where the suggestion is that Imam Ali, through this invocation, is in a station in which looking at him reminds the person of Allah. Then we come to Imam al-Ghazali and the story of him, the whole emphasis of him, in fact, of moving from taqleed, which is belief, blind belief or acceptance, to tahqiq, to realization or verification. And I'll just read from the introduction to the Book of Knowledge. And this is an introduction written by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. So Imam al-Ghazali makes two profound contributions to the science of tasawwuf. First, he elaborated on and significantly developed the work initiated by Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, who had explored the secrets behind the devotional practices of Islam. Imam al-Ghazali did this by bringing the same maqasidi, or spirit of the law approach, that he had brought to jurisprudence, whereby he explicated the entire religion using the lens of Sufism to reveal the inner meanings of the law. Unlike Sufi scholars who came before him and had argued that Tasawwuf was a third of Islam, as it was the science of Ihsan, Imam al-Ghazali's unique contribution was to show that Tasawwuf, in reality, the animating spirit, is in reality the animating spirit of the entire corpus of Islam. He believed, now this gets interesting, he believed that without this animating force, the religion was a dead thing. He critically referred to those scholars who failed to incorporate the practice of Tasawwuf in the Islam as formalists, people shackled by the trappings of religion, which thus prevented them from undertaking the necessary journey to the core of faith and from realizing for themselves its truth. And so, to my surprise, I came to learn that Imam al-Ghazali was actually actively suggesting that this journey be taken from taqlid to tahqiq, to subjective to objective reality, to realize this whole process of verification. And I've just put down here a picture of the Al-Ghazali's Children's Project, which interestingly Fons Vitae have developed as Sheikh Hamza Yusuf raised concerns about how his own children were receiving Islamic education. And so I think it's very interesting how even children are able to study his ideas and have a more holistic view or approach to understanding Islam, as opposed to one which is rooted or heavily emphasized in terms of the legal dimension. Before I carry on, are there any questions? Is everyone still with me? Can I just have a wave if you can hear me? All right, super. Thank you. All right, so then we come on to Rumi. And it's really interesting. The 13th century mystic, Hanafi judge, jurist, becomes one of the most widely selling poets in America and the US. So he's outselling Shakespeare and Byron and Blake and others, as well as other Eastern poets. And this was actually an article in the BBC, and so this wasn't just 1 year, it was over a few years. And so the question is, what is it that Rumi is saying? And he clearly starts his Masnavi. There's an Arabic introduction, which I believe is translated by Nicholson. So many people jump straight to the Persian, where he says, the Bashnu Asne Chu Hikayat Mikunat, listen to the read. But prior to that, there's an Arabic introduction in which he says this is the root of the Muhammadan religion. So from his perspective, the Masnavi is, and the Divan-e-Shams is nothing other than a pouring out from the same DNA of the Quran, from the Islamic tradition. And so he's journeyed to this dimension of Islam, which is both particular and universal. He's journeyed into this dimension, which speaks to us even some 800 years later, and it will always do, because it's from this timeless dimension. So that's an interesting phenomenon. Why is Rumi becoming popular now? So I'll just recite a few lines from him. In these lines, he's deconstructing the self. Remember my question right at the beginning was about cultural forms of religion and identity. And quite importantly, I think, people do need to have an identity of being Muslim, in this essential aspect of our development. But at some point in journeying, this identity, which is relative, is deconstructed or transcended. So Rumi has a poem to do with this, in which he deconstructs his identity, or this false self. He says, what can I do, O Muslims? I do not know myself. I'm neither Christian nor Jew, nor Magian nor Muslim. I am not from the east, nor the west, nor from land or sea, nor from the shafts of nature, nor from the spheres of the firmament, nor from the earth, not of the water, not of air, not of fire. I am not from the highest heaven, nor from this world, not from existence, not from being. I'm not from India, not from China, not from Bulgar, not from Saxene, not from the realm of the two Iraqs, not from the land of Khorasan. I'm not from the world, not from the beyond, not from heaven and not from hell. I'm not from Adam, not from Eve, not from paradise, not from Ridwan. My place is placeless, my trace is traceless. No body, no soul. I am from the soul of souls. I've chased out duality, lived the two worlds as one. I seek one, one I know, one I see, one I call. He's the first, he's the last, he's the outer, he's the inner. Beyond he and he is, I know no other. I am drunk from the cup of love. The two worlds have escaped me. I have no concern but carouse and capture. If one day in my life I spend a moment without you, from that hour and that time I would repent my life. If one day I'm given a moment in solitude with you, I will trample the two worlds underfoot and dance forever. O son of Tabriz, I am so tipsy here in this world. I have no tale to tell, but tipsiness and rapture. And so this is somebody who, remember, before meeting Shams, was a Hanafi scholar who gave fatwas, and suddenly something opened in him, and he's essentially saying this is the root of the root of the root of the Mohammedan religion. And he's speaking to us in a way which resonates with not just Muslims, but even, well, maybe more than Muslims, non-Muslims. And so the question is, which Islam or which dimension of Islam is he speaking from? What has he realized? Now, that obviously leads us to, well, who else is there in the Islamic tradition who's been speaking like this? And there's a whole host of Persian poets, from Rumi, Sadi, Hafiz, Hakim Sinai. Hafiz has become quite popular. And then poets from the East, so Iqbal, who's very popular in the Urdu Hindi-speaking world, as well as a number of Punjabi poets who are on par with the Persian Sufi poets, Baba Farid and Baba Bulleh Shah. And then you have a number of saintly figures in India who really took the message of Islam in and spread it in India, and are venerated even today. So Hazrat Amir Khusro, I believe he developed the form of the Qawwali, which Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan is famous for sharing with the world. And his teacher, Hazrat Nizamuddin Auliya, was a student of Hazrat Muhyiddin Chishti, who was a student of Baba Farid. And so you have this whole lineage of saintly figures who have influenced culture, but brought Islam as a message primarily of love, not necessarily as a legal system at the forefront, but actually one of love and humanity. And hence you have people of all faiths still visiting their tombs. I won't read Iqbal. I mean, that's just a universe on its own and probably deserves a whole talk. Another interesting aspect was this talk by Dr. Martin Lings, Sheikh Abu Bakr Sirajuddin, at the Shakespeare Globe Theatre in London, UK, with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And it was I think it was a 3-day event. And this was probably one of Martin Lings's last talks, or second to last talk. And he was a realized saint, as attested to by several shuyukh who met him. And his book, The Book of Certainty, was the first book on Islam which Sheikh Hamza Yusuf had picked up and read, and he confessed or suggested he didn't understand anything at the time. And Dr. Martin Lings was also a Shakespearean scholar. And he in his beautiful commentaries on Shakespeare, was able to show how they're just like Dante's Divine Comedy, who Dante himself suggested can be interpreted at 4 levels. And so he's found that Shakespeare can essentially be done in the same way. So the first level is a literal level, and a literal level, a historical level. There's the ethical or moral level, and then the anagogical symbolism. And from Dr. Lindsay's perspective, much like you have stories in the Masnavi, he found that in Shakespeare's plays, what was going on was this journey of what he terms purgatory pilgrims. And he starts one of his lectures by saying that he cites a hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, about the companions, about returning from the lesser war to the greater war. This is after returning to from battle. And when asked, Ya Rasulullah, what is this greater war? And the response was given to fight against your nafs. Some say it's a disputed hadith, but in principle, I'm sure there are various other hadith and teachings which would support that. So this example on the right is a painting of Abdul Wahid ad-Noon, who was the ambassador from Morocco in 1600, who visited Queen Elizabeth to form an alliance against the Spanish, who were there to kill or to capture the Moroccans and the Moors. And interestingly, this was also at the time when Shakespeare was quite active, was alive, obviously, in and had his various theatres set up. And so it could well have been that Shakespeare had met Abdul Wahid ad-Noon, and the question is being asked as to whether this character actually inspired Othello. Interestingly, the villain in Othello, Iago, is also named after Santiago Matamoros, Santiago the Moor-killer. And so the question can be asked as to whether Shakespeare was alluding to that being the face of evil. So that's an example of historical level being interpreted, but then you've got the moral as to what happened, and then on a deeper level, probably another talk, or I think you can find Dr. Lindsay's talks from the Shakespeare Globe on YouTube or elsewhere online. And then we now arrive at Amir Abdul Qadir Jazairi, and he's just this towering figure, often called like one of the last authentic Muslims, if you like, known for his absolutely strong character and his defiance. And I think he's got several streets named after him. He was given, I think there's lots of history around that. What many people might not know is just the depth of scholarship he displayed. And to give you an example, I've got his Mawaqif, his spiritual writings, and there's this chapter on he who speaks and he who listens. So he was steeped in Akbarian metaphysics and would spend the night in prayer and zikr. And it was that spiritual dimension or realization in him that allowed him to be so upright and ethical on the battlefield, and which led to a number of people who had captured him converting to Islam. So this is a sermon, and again, the depth of this is just mind-blowing. So he writes or says, God, may he be exalted, said, Quran chapter 7, verse 204, when the Quran is recited, whether it be, end quote, whether it be by you yourself or by someone else who recites it for you, which would explain the passive form of the verb, listen to him and be silent. perhaps you will receive mercy, on the condition that you listen to it as being the voice of Allah. For this word is the very word of Allah, and it is He alone who speaks it. And on the condition also that he who listens be Allah. For in every being, whether he knows it or not, Allah is He who speaks and He who listens. When He who recites and he who listens are one, it is the same as when one speaks to oneself and when one listens to oneself. So without taking things too literally, it's a beautiful example of this non-duality at play, which the mystics from Rumi and everyone, from Ibn Arabi and obviously Amir Abdul Qadir Jazairi, using the duality of language, are pointing to this non-duality of reality, this tawheed of reality. This naturally leads us on to the Shaykh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi himself, who, after I encountered some years ago, he was so comprehensive that it just left me just completely speechless in many respects. He provided such a comprehensive universal metaphysics, and the surprising thing was that it was all of it was rooted in the Qur'an and Hadith, and one could spend the night just talking about some aspect of the Shaykh al-Akbar. But just to give an example, he's able to derive the highest level of metaphysics and esoteric meaning through the most subtle nuances of language. In many respects, he's more literal than the literalists. Yet his metaphysics, which he says he hasn't written himself, but it's come through him, is the most comprehensive metaphysics I've ever encountered. And I've spoken to various people at the Ibn Arabi Society who've been reading Ibn Arabi for some 40 years. And I've asked, why would you read Ibn Arabi if you're not driven by faith? What is it that's driving you? Because you could be reading the Tao Te Ching, the Bhagavad Gita, and various esoteric commentaries on such classical texts. And they've said essentially the same thing, that what you find in Ibn Arabi, you just don't find anywhere else. So here's an example. You may know the hadith, which is mutawatir on the Gabriel hadith, in which Jibril comes and asks the Prophet, peace be upon him, what is Islam, what is Iman, what is Ihsan? And the Prophet responds, and the Prophet says he came to teach you your deen. So part of that definition of Ihsan is to worship God as though you see him, and if you do not see him, he sees you. فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَاهُ فَإِنَّهُ يَرَاكَ. So if you do not see him, he sees you. Ibn Arabi always accepts the literal meaning. He always accepts the orthodox standard meaning. But at the same time, for him, the Quran is never fixed in meaning. How can it be? It's a miracle from the divine himself. It's a speech of the divine. And so therefore, he finds everything in the Quran. So one of the things he does in this, he says, فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ تَرَهُ. So he applies the grammatical rule, which I believe you can do on the lam for being majzoom, and says essentially the meaning that he derives from here is, if you are not, you see him. So ultimately he sees himself. Shahid Allahu annahu la ilaha illahu. He bears witness to his oneness. But I'm not sure. I'm not qualified. There's nothing I can say about the Shaykh al-Akbar other than it's like the experience is like being a child in front of the ocean. I'm making no claims as to swimming in the ocean or understanding the ocean, but it's a shoreless ocean, that much I know. And so when I presented this to the students, they're only between 16 and 18. It's a dimension of Islam, a narrative of Islam they'd never encountered before. They asked me to run more khutbahs, which I politely declined. But it's the first time they had encountered their tradition. So this is not some new age modern interpretation of the tradition. These are people who, if you marginalize or remove, you wouldn't have much sort of left. And remember, we started from the Qur'an, went through Imam Ali to Rumi, and all these poets and other mystics who are, many of whom are scholars and of fiqh, Imam al-Ghazali, to Amir Abdul Qadir Jazari and Sheikh al-Akbar ibn Arabi. And yet these students were not people of, seeking some sort of spiritual enlightenment. They were just, or sort of, they weren't trained in usul of fiqh or the deen or the sciences of the deen. And yet a lot of this resonated with them. And so that's what really inspired the Hikmah Project. It was to give a platform in which some of these voices that sometimes don't make it to the Friday sermon or the mainstream forms of Islam, yet are a core part of the tradition, can have a voice, can have some space in which their ideas can be explored, and maybe it inspires a generation or those to come. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Tabriz. I hope some of that's been useful, and if it has been, praise belongs to Allah, and any faults are mine, and my sincere apologies if I've misquoted anything or if there's any mistakes in anything I've said. So if there's any questions, or I'm open to discussion, or any questions you may have, or anything you would like me to elaborate on, I'm more than happy to elaborate. I've just really given some headline sort of stories and quotes there. Yes, Tabriz.
Yes, Saqib, thank you again for a great presentation and great thoughts. As you were saying this, I was wondering, either yourself personally or any of the figures you mentioned, is there a theme of spiritual awakening or any sort of kind of things that happen that cause it, events, circumstances, or something that you see as a common theme, whether personally or any of the figures from your readings and understandings, or a meeting or anything of that nature? Such a broad question, but on my mind.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, there have been events in people's lives. So Rumi meets Shams. I don't think he was out looking for a guide. He was already an accomplished mystic and trained in the sciences of the soul. But Shams went there and shook him up and gave him this whole new sort of experience. But generally, I think there's a seeking of truth, and it starts with the question I asked at the beginning: how do I know there's the real? Interesting, Ibn Arabi uses the word haq quite a lot. The divine name al-haq, the truth, the real. And so how do you know that? Is it my subjective opinion and beliefs and ideas which I've defined reality in? Or is there an objective reality outside my subjective experience? And if so, how do I know that? So often you have people seeking the truth, and that then leads them onto this journey. And in many ways, the question can be asked, why are they seeking the truth? And then we get into non-duality, because as Rumi reminds us, again, everything's in the tradition. The only thing is on the mainstream sort of platforms and on the media, a lot of this side of Islam never makes it there. And so on Oprah, you'll have Thich Nhat Hanh and Eckhart Tolle talking about non-duality and presence. But for some reason, you don't get many Muslim scholars talking about it. in any case, Rumi has a beautiful story in which a man is invoking God, and I believe Shaitan appears to him and says, well, you're saying Allah, Allah. Have you ever had a response? And so he falls into despair. I'm just paraphrasing here. So, and then a voice says to him, your calling onto God is God's calling onto you. The only reason you can invoke God is because God has remembered you. And so our seeking of reality is really a pull from the other direction. Again, it takes us into this non-duality of the dhakir, the mazkur, and the dhikr being mysteriously interconnected or interrelated. So that's what I would say. I think generally it's been a seeking of some truth, and that's what led Imam al-Ghazali. I mean, he obviously, Sheikh Hamza has spoken a lot about him, but him being at the pinnacle of his career or of his scholarship, and people, you know, coming from all over the world to sit at his feet, and him questioning everything he knows, realizing that it's all conceptual. He hasn't verified anything for himself. It's the concepts, the things he's read, analyzed, and understood. And so he says God made him mute, he couldn't speak, and then he goes on this 10-year sort of journey seeking this knowledge of the heart, and then writes this Ihya Ulumuddin. So again, there was that seeking of this other form of knowledge, this higher reality, which is normally the sign. I hope that answers your question. We have another hand up.
Yes, thank you.
I think that's Fatima. Fatima, if that's you, go ahead and you can feel free. The floor is yours.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Thanks for remembering me, sister. I just have a quick question for the brother in terms of the practice of salah and the ways that we can derive what you've taught us tonight in terms of incorporating some of those themes and methods into our salah. Can you speak on that, brother?
Yes, that's a really beautiful question. Again, I don't feel this is false humility. I think this is genuine. It's not what I'm qualified to speak on. You know, I'm not saying that, you know, as a sort of statement, but in my humble understanding, you know, there's a couple of things that come to mind. So let me just make this as a reminder to myself, first and foremost. The salah, as the saying goes, is the mirage of the mu'min. And it has many dimensions to it. In and of itself, it's a form of dhikr, it's a remembrance. And a moment, a couple of things come to mind. The first is being mindful and present in your salah. And one thing that really helps me is tuning into the Arabic. And you don't necessarily need to be an Arabic scholar, but at least knowing what is it that you're reciting. And that attunes you to the meaning of what you're reciting. And as you're reciting it, if you then know some of the traditional commentaries of the great sages I've just mentioned, then that starts penetrating it. It can open up your heart. The other one is about need. Have you ever been to a hospital where you have the chaplain or the sort of faith space for people to pray in? Something I once did is I went into that space, and normally they have a sort of book where you can write, you know, a prayer and you can sign it, or you can just go and meet and just observe people there. Often they're praying, And there's a very deep need because one of the family members, or maybe themselves, but normally a family member or friend or colleague, is in crisis, is in, ill or injured or near death. And so these people are pleading, and it's pleading with your whole being. It's not just a ritual. It's not just a conditioned practice. They're there present with their complete being. Their heart is present, their mind is present, and their body is present. And when you pray like that, it's the most fulfilling sort of experience you can have. So that's the other thing. And the other thing to bear in mind that comes to me is Al-Hallaj, who famously said, Ana al-Haq, is reported, somebody said, I think it's one of his biographies, what was his practice? Well, he just spent the night in prayer, in Salat. He would just be reciting, all night. And so it's a very deep spiritual practice. You can sort of go in and see it as a spiritual practice. Then there's things about the dimensions, and somebody like Imam al-Ghazali or Ibn Arabi would probably go into that. And I know Dr. Ling's, in fact, I'm not sure if it's a published paper, but he does have something around the different dimensions of going into the different postures and the sujood, and the symbolic meanings. So why do you go into sujood twice? One interpretation is you annihilate the self, you go in, you put yourself completely low, the head goes below the heart, and then the second one is to annihilate your annihilation. It's to completely become empty. The salawat ala nabi, when we make ahtayatu lillahi wa salawatu wa tayyibatu ashhadu an la ilaha, so assalamu alayka ayyuhan nabiyyu rahmatullahi, we are mukhatib, when you use the pronoun ka, we are saying as though he is present in front of us. And again, I'll leave it to you to explore what is this salawat ala nabi. When Allah says in the Quran, Inna Allah wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi, God and his angels send salutations upon salawat upon the Prophet. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima. Oh, you have faith, send your salutations, blessings upon the Prophet. There are many, and people have written, the sages, Imam Ibn Arabi has written on the Haqiqa Muhammadiyya, this light, this primordial substance of which the Prophet, peace be upon him, alluded to when he said, I was a prophet when Adam was between water and clay. So we're not referring to just a prophet, a historical figure. And a lot of these symbols have inner sort of meanings, and as you journey, they start opening up. So it's less of, I'm sorry if I'm going on a bit here, but it's less of a how-to guide of step 1, 2, 3, but a couple of things to bear in mind through being mindful, turning to your heart, reflecting, tafakkur, tadabbur on the Quranic recitation you're doing, sincerity, ikhlas. And finally, it's what Imam al-Ghazali is absolutely brilliant at, and that is to dig out hidden, apparent and also hidden signs of hypocrisy. And he did that first and foremost with himself. So this was when, this is the verse in the Quran in which Allah says, woe to the alladhina hum an salatihim sahun, those who establish prayer to be seen. So it's to turn towards Allah in sincerity, but also being aware that the nafs or shaitan, and working through the nafs, can walk into the back door at any time and start making an identity. And that's where spiritual or religious pride comes in and says, I pray more than you, so I must be better. I've spent more, I do my nafil as well, and the sunnah you've neglected, and all of that sort of comes in. So it's being mindful of both, and that's in this journey. That's what all of Shakespeare's plays are about. It's this purgatory sort of pilgrim. But the beginning, I would say, is start with being mindful. But sorry, just one last thing. Imam al-Ghazali is where I'll probably he'll probably elaborate on that in a lot more depth. Does that answer your question?
Yes, mashallah.
Any other comment?
I have one question. Can you
Yeah.
share just a little bit more about the specific type of programming that the Hikmah Project puts out there? And maybe for those here who have joined us or who will be watching later, how could one get involved, if at all possible, considering I think most of us are based here in the States?
Yeah, so Tabriz is on the call. What I'll do, in fact, is I can just very quickly give you a whistle-stop tour of the Hikmah Project, just so that you know what it looks like, because there are a couple of sites with similar names. So here it is. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So basically, it's an interesting story how this came about. I didn't intend to set this up. So it just it just sort of came about, and then I just kept it going, and then it sort of grew organically. But essentially, you've got podcasts, and these are with various people, sheikhs and scholars, and here's one on the spiritual significance of Ertugrul and Ibn Arabi, for example. Dr. Abdullah Rahman, the principal at Cambridge Islamic College. Helwa, the Secrets of Divine Love. So there's various podcasts, and they're completely free, because that's the purpose of the Hikmah Project. It's to support and give a sort of voice. There's one with Aisha Gray Henry, the founder of Fons Vitae, and we talk about the Ghazali Project. So all of this is completely free. And then you also have circles, so you can join these circles at any time. Today we've just, funny enough, just started Ibn Arabi circle. So we are reading his works, and then there's a journaling circle on the Secrets of Divine Love. And so that's how you can, Tabriz has been part of that, and I'm sure he can elaborate and talk more about that. But we try and, so once the group comes together, we then try and adjust the times so that they work for everyone. Alhamdulillah, Tabriz has managed to attend. We've got a few other friends from the US as well. And when they're not able to attend, we do record them and then release them. And during these circles, I tend to invite scholars or learned people, or people who are experts in Gnostic academics, not just academics, but people who've sort of polished the heart or worked with the heart. And sometimes they come in and give a talk or do a sohbet, that sort of dialogue. And currently we're trying to expand and look at things like the Ghazali Children's Project, and see how we can set up circles and have community-based approaches of developing some of these things. And so you can subscribe to the podcasts, and then there are various subscriptions. So one of the things you could do is just to support the project. Let me see if I come in as I've actually signed in, so I need to sign out. But you can quite easily support. So you could be, firstly, completely free. You can sign up as a free member, so you just get newsletters and updates. And then you could do a yearly or monthly, and then that gives us some funding to come in and start looking at projects. So as a member, you get transcripts and accompanying material and that sort of thing. And then obviously you can sign up to one of the circles. And if finance is an issue, it should never be an issue in terms of joining. There are scholarships, and we do offer free places as well if needed. Does that answer your question? Is there anything you'd like me to elaborate on?
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
No
And I'll toss it back over to Tabriz.
Yeah, and what I'll do is I'll post a link in the chat if anybody wants to explore. They can.
Thank you again, and it's been great to be part of Circle. I've learned a lot from others, and myself just exploring deeper, and it's been great. Actually, my follow-on question is, besides what's going on now, what may be future circles or classes that you may offer that you're sort of maybe contemplating? I may follow up with you offline on that, but if you have some initial thoughts, that'd be great to hear.
Yeah, so I think if you go to the team, there are various teachers and scholars, and one of the things I'd be very keen to have is some of these teachers actually teaching their text or their books or a paper they've written. Dr. Hani Ibrahim is an example. I think he's quite keen to run an introductory course to Ibn Arabi. So I'm keen for that to happen. And then maybe instead of reading circles, in addition to reading circles, have sort of events like this where we've got a learned person or a specialist in Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, or something, something like that, who can then give talks and address the newer generation or different generations of seekers. And let's see, I mean, this project currently has just grown organically rather than a strategic plan. It's been more sort of agile, and I'm quite happy with the way, because it sort of grows through interest, and where people have raised a request, or where my heart, I've felt guided to start something. So it's really, let's see what happens.
Thank you.
I had just one more comment. You mentioned Amir Abdul Qadir, and you mentioned that there's some streets that are named after him. I don't know if you know this, but here in Iowa, where I'm located, there's actually a town called El Qadir, and it is named after him.
Oh my God! Wow.
Totally random. I can't remember the origins, but you mentioned his name. Like, oh yeah, no, we have a town named after him.
Yeah. Oh my God. Oh wow. I mean, there was a whole thing on American president sending him horses and guns and cities named after him. I mean, he was just such an influential figure. Yet I hadn't come across his writings before. Nobody had really spoken about it. And this book here, The Spiritual Writings of Mir Abdul Qadir, when I opened it, it was just absolutely mind-blowing in terms of his depth and metaphysics. It was just, wow. So
beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments from those who have joined us tonight? If not, Tabrez, do you want to close us out?
Sure. I'll just do it verbally here. So again, thank you, Saqib, for your time and sharing so much, and also the link and more about the Hikmah Project to others here. I'm sure there'll be those listening to this later, and they'll be informed and may follow up with you. It's been great having you, and also being part of the circle myself, and enjoying and learning from the Hikmah Project.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you once again for inviting me, and for our listeners, both present now and you may be listening at some other time. I hope you found something useful here, and it's helped you turn towards the heart. And may Allah open the way and give your project, the third space, much success. And thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.
Ameen. Jazakallah, Brother Saqib, and to all those that are here. Inshallah, we will see you back online or in person if you were in Austin, inshallah, at a time close. But thank you so much.
Thank you.